Hello guys, it's sure has been a while since I've made a video and well actually no, actually I have been reading De Ente, but continuing it's been some time that I've uploaded a video on meditation series and the reason for this I hope you guys understand me. School. And I don't know why, but it's my spring break and I'm supposed to have a lot of time, but that's actually not the case for some reason. I have like so much exams after this break, and for some reason, um, I, I don't know why some teachers like to assign a lot of homework and projects over the break. Um, but yeah, but by no means I just wanted to tell you that's the reason why I haven't been much time. I haven't been able to spend much time making these slides or videos. Of course, on like meditations or my book series, but they will come. They're inevitable, of course. I will continue them. Um, but yeah, I'm sorry to share you with that because that's not what you're here for. But this is what you're here for. Meditation 4, concerning the true and the false. Let's get to it, guys. Okay, now in Meditation 4, Descartes shifts his focus on the issue of error and falsehood. And remember, in Meditation 3, he established that God exists. And now he's going to answer how human beings created by a perfect God are still able to make mistakes and ultimately be in error. And he also answers the question later why God would allow this. Right, but obviously I'm not gonna mention it here right now. Well, actually, well, I will tell you. The reason why he says that, well, actually, he says that we cannot grasp or we cannot truly grasp what God does. Since the human judgment is so finite compared to God's, infinite will and infinite knowledge and wisdom, we cannot grasp the vivacity of God's actions per se, right? And so that's why it would be trivial to try to say, well, why does God allow error? And Descartes remembers one thing, that the God, whatever God does or whatever God wills, is ultimately for the best thing possible, for the best purpose. So at least he knows that. But Descartes says that we cannot truly know certain things that God does, obviously, right? Okay. And so Descartes says that things of God can be more known than about the mind. And remember, Descartes' existence is sustained at every moment. Like I've talked about essential priority, right? Which is sorry, a causal chain based off of essence and nature, right? The prior members are of a higher eminence, and so remember, Descartes' existence is sustained at every moment because of God. God is essentially prior to Descartes. And Descartes proved that God couldn't be a deceiver in the prior meditation because deception is an imperfection, and by definition, God is a perfect being, so that cannot hold, and therefore God is not a deceiver. Um, this ability to deceive may seem like, I guess, a uh, sign of like intellectual whatever cleverness or power, but the will to deceive is a sign of malice or weakness. But since God is perfect, he cannot deceive humans, right? And so since he established that God is not a deceiver, this is going to give him a big boost in certainty, and proving that God exists and that God is not a evil deceiver. Therefore, he can trust what he clearly and distinctly perceives. So then Descartes notices that he has a faculty, specifically the faculty of judgment. Like everything else within him, this faculty was given to him by God. And so since God does not deceive, Descartes says that God had given him a reliable faculty of judgment, and if he used it correctly, he would not be led to error. So furthermore, Descartes notices two ideas that come to mind, which one is a positive idea of God, who is supremely perfect, then he has a negative idea of nothingness, which is the greatest possible absence of perfection. And so Descartes notices that he is the middle ground between these two extremes because he isn't God, he isn't an infinite being, but he also isn't just nothingness because he exists as a thinking thing. And so since Descartes was created by God, who is a supremely powerful and all good being, nothing within Descartes directly leads to deception or error. So then again, obviously he isn't perfect, so he still lacks certain things. And because of this, his errors don't arise from God himself, but they arise from Descartes' own imperfection, which is his participation in non-being. And Descartes says that error is not a real thing created by God. Just like evil is the absence of good, and Descartes gives us an example of how darkness is just the absence of light. In the same way that error is just merely a privation, it is a lack of something that should be present. Thus, since error is just a privation, it does not thereby require a special faculty given by God, since error occurs because humans are finite, and so are their judgments. However, one question pops up, and that Descartes asks, which is, if God is a perfect creator, why didn't he make Descartes incapable of error? The answer is because that Descartes thinks of is that God always wills what is best, like I have mentioned. Descartes also says that there are things God does that humans cannot understand ultimately, but just because we cannot, understand God's actions or reasons does not mean that God does not have good reasons. And so, using the same reasoning, Descartes says that when we evaluate the works of God, such as works in creation, we cannot just examine one single creation in isolation, but instead we must look at it from a holistic standpoint. And so this is because a single creature individually might seem to be flawed and imperfect. However, when you look at it at a more holistic context of the universal system, it may be necessary and perfect in its role. Just like a house is not just a pile of wood and bricks, the house has structure, unity, right? And so this means that imperfections in individual beings do not necessarily indicate that God's creation itself is imperfect. And so Descartes initially Descartes began by doubting everything. He basically established all beliefs as false at the beginning, but now he has arrived at two certain indubitable truths. One, that he exists as a he exists as a thinking thing. Second is that God exists as a perfect being. But continuing on the source of error, Descartes gives us two sources of errors that must work together in order to even cause error. These are actually, one, the faculty of knowing, which is the intellect, and two, the faculty of choosing, which is the will or choice or free will. And so what you need to take away is that errors arise from the interaction between these two faculties, not a faculty by itself. So the faculty of knowing would not just itself cause error, nor would the faculty of choosing cause error by itself. So the intellect allows Descartes to perceive ideas and is responsible for forming judgments about things, but the intellect doesn't actually make mistakes. Why? Is because the intellect simply presents ideas, and the actual errors occur only when judgments are made incorrectly. Although Descartes lacks knowledge of many things, this lack of knowledge isn't a defect, but rather it is a limitation. He cannot also just claim that God should have given him a greater intellect, because there is no reason to assume that God was even obligated to give every creation the greatest possible intellect. So, consider the example, an expert craftsman. He does not put every possible perfection into every single object he makes, and therefore God also does not need to make every creature perfect in every way. And so, Descartes says that his faculty of will also isn't deficient, and he actually says it is boundless, unlike the intellect, though which is bounded and limited. The intellect is bounded and limited to what it perceives or makes judgment on. But Descartes also cannot conceive of a greater will than the one he already possesses, because the will is the faculty that makes humans most like God. Even though God's will is infinitely powerful, when we look at the human will in its most purest form, it is identical in nature to divine will. And by nature here, Descartes is not saying that they're exactly the same or that they're essentially the same. Or he's saying, well, actually no, he actually is saying that they're essentially the same in one way. Descartes is comparing that the human will to the divine will because they're essentially the same in the sense that they share freedom. He is not saying that they're exactly the same thing. Descartes says this is because the will, uh, in the divine will and the human will, it has the same freedom. It's simply the ability to affirm or deny something and to pursue or avoid something. But obviously, it's not the same because God's will is ultimately accompanied by infinite knowledge and His wisdom. And so, and when you consider this ability in itself, it doesn't differ from God's own will. The only difference is that God's will is, obviously, as I have said, accompanied by infinite knowledge and power and wisdom, whereas the human will is limited in its judgment and applications. Now, Descartes embraces the question of free will because if his will is so perfect, why does he still make mistakes? Now, Descartes gives us a distinction about what freedom is. One, that freedom, true freedom, does not mean being equally inclined toward all choices. Two, instead, the more a person is drawn toward truth and goodness, the freer they actually are. This means that when one clearly perceives what is true, they are least indifferent and are actually the most free. Fun fact, indifference, which is the state where nothing compels a choice, is actually a defect, not a perfection. Why? Because it means that when a person is uncertain about a choice, they are not experiencing a higher form of freedom, but rather a lack of knowledge. But since neither the intellect nor the will is defective on its own, errors must thereby come from the way the will interacts with the intellect. And so Descartes says that the cause of error is that when the will extends farther than the intellect can only understand certain things, but the will can make judgments about everything, even things the intellect does not fully understand. And so when the will makes judgments about things the intellect does not fully grasp, mistakes occur. For example, consider believing fake news on social media, which a lot of people do, by the way. Um, but yeah, believing fake news on social media without verifying the facts in which your will accepts it as true, even though your intellect lacks clear evidence. So, what is the solution of error, or to error? And Descartes says it is withholding judgment whenever something is not clearly and distinctly perceived. But Descartes also explains indifference, which is the lack of compelling reason to choose one alternative over another, applies not only to situations where the intellect knows nothing, but it also applies to cases where knowledge is insufficiently clear. So, even if there are probable guesses, pulling him in one direction, simply recognizing that these are mere guesses rather than certain and indubitable proofs can push him in the opposite direction. So consider the example he gives us. He initially supposed that all his previous beliefs were false, but he was able to do this because he recognized that doubt could be raised about them. So, yeah, basically take the example of his senses also as well. Descartes' will was so inclined to believe that what his senses provided him actually existed, um, but Descartes, finding doubt in it, pushed them to the opposite direction to say, no, they're not reliable, right? That's a good example of that. And so Descartes says that if he withholds judgment when something is not clearly and so distinctly understood, he is using his free will correctly, and he doesn't commit error now. But if he asserts or denies something without sufficient intellectual clarity or evidence, he is misusing his free will. So there are two outcomes. One, if he chooses a false belief, he is obviously in error, okay? And two, if he chooses a true belief but without clear understanding, he is still at fault. Even though he happens to be right, this is merely luck and not proper reasoning. Fun fact, this wouldn't also be considered knowledge under the JTB standard, which is justified true belief plus Gettier. Gettier is saying that there can't the belief cannot just happen, or the belief being true cannot just be of a accident or of straight luck. And the most common example I've seen is a alarm, where someone wakes up, sees it's 6 a.m. on the clock, but the clock was just broken and stayed there the whole time, and we would say that is not knowledge, right? And so Descartes importantly says that the intellect must always precede the will when making judgments. Error is a privation, which is the lack of proper judgment, which means the fault lies not in God's creation, but in human misuse of free will. It is in the nature of a finite intellect to be limited, and this is not a flaw, but simply what it means to be a created being itself. So remember, the will extends over the intellect because the intellect is finite, but the will is limitless, right? It endlessly pursues, it endlessly affirms or denies. And the will simply consists in the ability to affirm or to deny or to pursue or avoid. And so since the will is not made of different parts, it is not reducible or limited without destroying its nature. Though some people might ask why God allows humans to make errors if he is perfect. And Descartes says that the acts of the will, which are judgment, are true and good insofar as they depend on God, meaning that since God gave humans free will, it is inherently good because logically it follows that God is good and God's creation is also inherently good, right? Good is actually a transcendental, and I've explained what transcendentals are. Hopefully, if you watch my other video, that good as a transcendental and transcendental properties are properties that apply to all beings. And so error only arises from privation, which is a lack of knowledge, and it does not come from God. Error and evil are not created things. It's not a thing in the first mode of existence. And when I refer to first mode of existence, I'm saying that it actually exists in reality, but it still exists in some way in the second mode of existence, which it exists as a logical subject of a sentence. And it is by no means an imperfection that God has given humans the freedom to make mistakes. And going back, we have to view creation in a holistic sense rather than looking at mere individuals. And God allows errors because it contributes to the perfection of the universe as a whole, right? And so remember, in order for you to avoid error, according to Descartes in this meditation, only affirm what is clearly and distinctly perceived. If there is no clear and distinct perception of something, withhold your judgment of it. Only then can you avoid error and deception. And this is the end of meditation 4 notes. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Have a good night, or good day, good morning.